Thank you everybody for coming. We're excited to have this program about the new book, Toil and Trouble, A Woman's History of the Occult. We're excited to have both authors here, Lisa Kröger and Melanie R. Anderson. Lisa Kröger is the co-author of the Bram Stoker and Locus Award-winning Monster She Wrote. She holds a PhD in English, and her short fiction has appeared in Cemetery Dance Magazine and Lost Highways, Dark Fictions from the Road. She co-hosts the No Fear podcast. And Melanie R. Anderson is the co-author of the Bram Stoker and Locus Award-winning Monster She Wrote. She is an assistant professor of English at Delta State University in Cleveland, Mississippi. Her book, Spectrality in the Novels of Toni Morrison, was a winner of the 2014 South Central MLA Book Prize. She co-hosts the No Fear podcast. And let's get to their presentation.
All right. Well, hi. Thanks for having us. And thank you, everybody, for coming. We're really excited about our new book, Toil and Trouble, A Women's History of the Occult. I'm going to start off, well, Mel and I both will start off by reading a little bit from our introduction from the book, because I think this is a really good both introduction to the thesis and what we're talking about in this book, but also I think it will just give you a nice little sense of what's coming tonight, and it will lead into some of the women and people that we're going to highlight in our talk. So I'm just going to jump in. In July 2020, at a time when we arguably did not need any more problems, a group of young witches tried to hex the moon. It doesn't really matter why or whether they were successful. The moon's still here, so maybe not. In fact, it's not clear how many people were involved or how serious they were. People outside the online occult community found out about the event through social media posts about what these so-called baby witches were planning and why it was a bad idea, and through a cascade of news stories about the rumor on sites like BuzzFeed. That doesn't really matter either. What's important is that there's an online occult community at all. And not only that, but a community so robust and popular that it is able to sustain fringe groups, like the witches who hexed the moon, and warring factions, like the people who suggested that maybe they shouldn't. What's also important is that all of this happened in public. This would have been unthinkable to women in the 17th century New England, even if they could get past the idea of the internet. Witch used to be an accusation with potentially fatal consequences, not an identity to proudly display and endlessly debate in the public square. Those long ago women might be similarly shocked by the recent popularity of crystals, tarot cards, and astrology memes. In an age of uncertainty, dislocation, and environmental turmoil, younger generations are taking a renewed interest in astrology, horoscopes, and the occult, wrote Josh Walker in a 2020 Wired article.
That renewed interest is more like a tidal wave. On the social video app TikTok, which is popular with people in their teens and 20s, the hashtag witch talk garnered more than 2 billion views in 2019 and 20. Driving those views were videos offering everything from good luck spells to protection potions, in other words, predictability in times of uncertainty. After all, young adults in 2020 were getting ready to enter the world in scary times: economic downturn, a terrible job market, political uncertainty, public protests, and a pandemic raging out of control. But it's more than just difficult times that are responsible for young people's, and especially young women's, interest in the occult. From the start of the United States, whose colonial period coincided with the violent witch hunts of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, women have had a close relationship with the occult, at times whether they wanted to or not. Over the years, women have been variously cast as unnatural, supernatural, angelic, demonic, attuned to death, or in league with the devil. So how did we get from Salem to today's proud witches? Centuries of women responded to these accusations by using the occult as a route to power. All right, so that was just a little bit from the introduction to the book. Now we're going to talk a little bit about a few of the figures that you'll encounter when you read Toil and Trouble, just to give you a little bit of a taste. So each of us will talk about a figure and kind of pass it back and forth, and then we'll conclude and hopefully get to answer some of your questions. So the first figure that we want to talk about is one of our earliest ones, and this is the public universal friend. So the public universal friend was a religious leader in the 18th century, and their story illustrates how the people in our book were pursuing radical change and or protest from the very beginning of this nation. And I think once you hear me talk about the friend's story, you'll also see that it has a lot in common with some issues of our current time as well. So Jemima Wilkinson was born in Rhode Island in 1752. She was raised a Quaker, but she was fascinated by religion and very curious about other newer denominations, particularly Baptist congregations. Around 1776 or so, Wilkinson fell seriously ill, and her family and doctor thought that she would die. Now, according to the public universal friend, when they rose from Wilkinson's sickbed, Jemima Wilkinson did die, but the old body had been reanimated by God to be a vessel for a prophet with no gender. The friend then began preaching a more inclusive message for their followers, known as the Society of Universal Friends. And this movement was a bit more welcoming to women in preaching and leadership positions than other Protestant denominations. And throughout their life, the friend avoided gendered pronouns. Their followers used the pronouns he and him to signal the great shift from Wilkinson to the friend. But detractors of the friend continue to use their old name and the pronouns she and her. Before the friend's death in Western New York, where the society had migrated, the group received a blow in that they lost some parcels of land for their encampment. The courts did not recognize the friend's changed name and status as legal.
So what we saw, or what we started with the public universal friend, is a person really kind of pushing back against what was what still is a patriarchal religious structure in this country, and attempting to use occult means to kind of push back against that, and also to find a space for their own voice to come across, which is something that is really important and that we track over the course of the book. And so kind of jumping forward just a little bit into the 19th century, we do end up talking quite a bit about the spiritualist period. Now, the spiritualist period is something we talked about a little bit in Monster, She Wrote. It kind of, there's a lot of things that I think connect the two books. And I know I speak for Mel and myself both when I say that it's a personal interest, almost bordering on obsession with us. But of course, a little bit of background on the spiritualist movement. In 1848, the Fox sisters spoke with a ghost in their New York home. Of course, this was when they heard the spirits, and they started rapping on the walls, or heard the rapping on the walls to communicate with it. But basically, it kicked off the spiritualist movement that would continue on. Pretty much for a century, just kind of ebbing and flowing in popularity. But what was really unique about the spiritualist movement is it allowed for women and people of color to really step into the public view and begin to use their voice and find a platform that they could talk about. So what was really interesting is that spiritualists could use their voice in a safe way, kind of a quote unquote safe way, especially for women. Now, at this point, women were supposed to be relegated to the home. Of course, there's the Victorian notion of the angel of the house, the fact that they were really supposed to be mothers, wives, that was their realm, not the outside world. But using spiritualism, they could work from the home, or they could work in other people's homes. So it still kind of maintained that safe space for them. They also had the cloak of Christianity to also kind of offer something safe for them It's the idea that they were channeling messages from loved ones who had recently passed and confirming the idea of a Christian heaven in doing this. And so they were able to kind of bypass this notion that they were doing anything occult or satanic by saying, no, we're simply reaching across the veil and talking to people who are passed on to God in heaven. So this is really, really interesting. This is also key, where spiritualism is key to the progress of women's resistance to the patriarchy. So spiritualist mediums who came after the Fox sisters, including the Fox sisters too, but they were able to build businesses. They could make money. They could even secure fame while doing this. We didn't see this in American history, at least not offered to women in quite this way. So mediums, one of the things that we found really interesting when we talk about them using their platform is they were able to kind of espouse their own political beliefs, and again, kind of do it safely, or at least something that would be accepted by society, because they were using somebody else's channeled voices. So in this time period, if you were not a white male with money, essentially your beliefs on, or your thoughts on politics and religion, they just didn't count. They didn't matter at all, not to public discourse. But now suddenly mediums kind of on all sides of the political spectrum could essentially, to an audience, and sometimes these audiences grew to thousands of people, but could get up on stage and they could safely put out their own beliefs. It wasn't unheard of for mediums, say, to channel a respectable name like Benjamin Franklin and just happen to say that, hey, Franklin wants you to know that this country needs to end slavery. That's just kind of an example of what a medium might do in order to get across a political message without receiving the backlash to it. Now, this isn't what all mediums did. There were just some examples. One notable example in particular that we talk about in the book that I think is particularly interesting are two women, Mother Leafy Anderson and one of her students, Mother Catherine Seal. She was born Nanny Cowens. So Mother Leafy Anderson would found what would become now known as the spiritual religion in New Orleans in the 1930s. She built the Temple of Innocent Blood. Her student did, Mother Catherine Seals, based on Anderson's teachings in the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans. Now, early on in this church, spiritualism and seances and that sort of thing were much more important than they were later. But one thing that I just kind of want to point out as an example of how women were able to use occult means to gain power. This was in Jim Crow era South. And here we have a Black woman who not only opens a church and maintains that power there, she did receive a lot of backlash for this, which we talk about and get into more, but it was a church that welcomed all genders, it welcomed all ages, and it welcomed all races. And it was a moment in time where they were really focusing on pushing for inclusivity, but also working for healing and justice in the community. That was one of the things that was really important to them, was that they were able to open their doors to everybody. So they are just kind of an example of how you have somebody who works and begins to gain a reputation in what we would consider the occult realm, and then leverage that into something else, which is really kind of fascinating.
Okay, now I'm going to talk about a figure and a group, basically, who are more involved in outright kind of either political influence or even political protest. So the first person I'm going to talk about is Madame Marcia. So Madame Marcia Champney found her way to what she termed the hub of power by creating connections to those in the White House. She was born in 1867, and she ended up having to take on kind of odd jobs to help support her family, both when she was young and later when she was a single mother supporting her kids and her mother. She ended up doing a stint in kind of in vaudeville and theater, and she learned different practices such as fortune telling and tarot and palm reading. And once she became a spiritualist minister and added astrology to her skill set, she decided to move to Washington, D.C. So this would have been in 1909. And after she moved there, they started flying around some rumors that she was doing sittings with politicians and or their spouses. So these are rumors, but at least one first lady cited those rumors for why she started going to see Madame Marcia. So by 1926, Madame Marcia had consulted with two first ladies, Edith Galt, who married President Wilson, and Florence Harding. She later said that she had been consulted by Florence Harding as an astrologer and clairvoyant to help schedule meetings at the best possible times. And she kind of implied that she had done charts for different personnel that Florence Harding was trying to decide would be compatible within the workplace. The madam was also involved in the congressional fortune-telling hearings of 1926, where she faced off against Houdini. So there was a law under proposal that would basically make fortune-telling and other occult practices illegal, and spiritualist practices were included in the original draft of this. And so they had congressional hearings, and Houdini was supporting expanding basically the law. And then Madame Marcia and her compatriots were arguing that spiritualism should be respected because of freedom of religion. And they were against the law, period, but that was their main argument. Basically, the spiritualists won out. Eventually, the wife of one of the politicians that was there, I'm blanking on her exact name right now, but she practiced spiritualism and testified that it was very much like Christianity and it had been passed down through her family and it was very important to her as her religion. And so for that time, spiritualism was not included. So that is Madame Marcia, someone who kind of was on the outskirts of power, maybe influence power. So the occult can also be connected to protest. So I want to talk just a little bit about the witch movement. And this is the acronym WITCH, or the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, which began in New York in 1968 with a group of women. They broke off from a larger women's liberation group, the New York Radical Women. And they initially pursued what they called kind of guerrilla theater protests. So these were quick protests designed to shock and gain attention, such as on one Halloween, they dressed in stereotypical witch garb with pointy hats and brooms, and they hexed Wall Street. In addition to protesting capitalism, the group also marched against the patriarchy at a bridal fair at Madison Square Gardens on Valentine's Day. And one of the founders, Robin Morgan, has noted that other witch groups popped up across the nation after the initial one gained attention. So in an original collection that she made of documents and material related to the early witch organization, she wrote, "A certain common style, insouciance, theatricality, humor, and activism unite all these covens, which are otherwise totally autonomous and unhierarchical. And while witch may seem a part of the past and the protests of the 1960s and 70s, Robin Morgan recently told the New York Times in 2019 that she has been contacted by young protesters wanting to start their own witch groups. And some groups calling themselves witch have staged protests in the 21st century."
Yeah, that was one of the more fascinating things that I think we looked at over the course of our research in this is how, once women have kind of established themselves in the occult space, how quickly that occult space was then turned into actual activism and useful protest. So not only do we talk about like the witch group and their protest, but we also mentioned how there have been cases where witch groups have worked with civil liberties groups to make sure that there's a separation of church and state, or to make sure that like students, for instance, who may be practicing in the occult aren't treated any differently than any of the other students. And then most recently, the Satanic Temple and their work to make sure that everybody has the right to access safe abortions. So that was one of the, I think, the really fascinating things that we were able to see the occult space being used to do that. I'm going to end with a person who is working in the occult space today. And what's really interesting about this particular moment is that even though I think in a lot of ways we're experiencing kind of a moral panic or a satanic panic, similar to the one in the 80s and the early 90s, especially with the like QAnon conspiracies and people getting worried that, showing your child hocus pocus is going to turn them into witches. There is kind of a panic about that. One thing that is really fascinating to watch is that the occult space really isn't being affected in the same way it has been in the past when we've had these moments of moral panic. I think with the internet and with social media, it's just kind of impossible to silence those community voices. And so it's really neat to look at what some of these voices are doing. So we end the book talking about a particular person, Alice Sparkly Cat, who is an astrologer and an author. Now, they were born in China and immigrated to the States as a child. So they grew up, from what they write about, frustrated and alienated after being confronted with gentrification and colonization that they saw all around them in their world. They use examples of their home in Brooklyn, for instance, and seeing the gentrification that happens there, or even looking at their former neighborhood in China and seeing some of the colonization and gentrification that was happening there. But I think even more troubling in what they write about and lecture about is that colonization that has crept into a lot of occult practices. So I mentioned they're an astrologer, and astrology is largely filtered through a Western lens, and it incorporates the language of white supremacy and patriarchy, which the work that Sparkly Cat is doing is actively trying to break down. So for instance, just to kind of give you an example of what we mean, when we talk about the planets in astrology, a lot of times we're using the names of Roman gods and goddesses. A lot of times they're even gendered. So for instance, Mars and Venus, we tend to think of Mars as more masculine and Venus as more feminine. Again, it's a very flawed system. So what Sparkly Cat is doing in their current work is trying to take back the language of astrology to recenter that lens that we're looking at it through, and using it, this is their words, to create communities of care. So this is one of the things that we kind of ended with in the book, because Toil and Trouble really, we say it's a women's history of the occult. It's really more than that, because it's looking at starting in Salem with the witch trials. It's looking at how women, non-binary people, people of color have all been harmed by structures of colonization, of white patriarchy, of religion. And we're looking at how kind of over the course of the time, the occult world is trying to make communities of care, as Sparkly Cat calls them. And one of the really cool things that we're seeing, especially today, is that the occult world is increasingly becoming more open and inclusive. So, of course, Sparkly Cat's work is really just kind of one example of that, because more and more people are beginning to question ideas of patriarchy and white supremacy and cultural appropriation in the occult world, which then, of course, changes the lens of how we see things outside of the occult world. And one thing that everybody is trying to do is say that everyone really is included at the table, provided that we are being careful and we're being considerate when we do that. So I think that's a really, at least for me, when I start to see some of the troubling things in the world, it's really comforting to see that there are these communities that are actively trying to restructure how we speak about things and to create these kind of communities of care. So yeah, that's kind of very, very quick. We tried to choose people that would really kind of show the arc of how that history bends in our country. So we started with the public universal friend, and now we've ended with Alice Sparkley Cat and their work in astrology. There's a lot more that we could cover, but we're trying to keep it to 30 minutes as best we can. So yeah, I think at this point, we'd really love to open it up to questions and kind of have a greater conversation based on some of your thoughts.
You could put your questions in the chat. Oh, Joe said, thank you for this positive message. Oh, and Steve said, are you familiar with Madame Blavatsky? We have some of her biographies at our library.
Yeah, we talk a little bit about Madame Blavatsky in the book. Madame Blavatsky is one of those really interesting figures, I think, because you can definitely see a shift when she came along, because so many people after her were influenced, I mean, just by her person. So yeah, we do talk about Madame Blavatsky in the book a little bit.
And Dave said, just thinking about how society went from persecution in the 17th century to acceptance. Why do you think it happened?
I feel like, well, there's still persecution even today, but I feel like if you're thinking of the persecution that was happening in Salem, if you're thinking specifically about the United States, it was a lot of the religious worldview that the settlers had brought with them, and a lot of the social and political issues that they had struggled with in Europe before they came, and also a lot of the social and political and even economic issues they were struggling with in their colonial situation, that I think made them jump more to persecution. It was kind of baked into the tradition. If you think of, like the witch's hammer, the Malleus Maleficarum, which kind of gave instructions for finding witches, and it was very patriarchal and set in like in the Christian religion. So I think that kind of fan the flames. I do think over the years there has been a tendency sometimes in pop culture to place witches as different or maybe dangerous, but I feel like in some ways the arguments that some of the people in our book made that these practices are religion and should be respected as such made a big impact. And I feel like as we've gone on and get to our time now, we are in a moment where people in different parts of the country who may or may not feel welcome with the practices that they want to partake in can communicate with folks in other parts of the country. So I think the internet, which, as we mentioned in the intro, is something that people couldn't have even thought of in the 1600s, the 1700s, has kind of opened up like the communication people can have about this. And so, if you're a person who's in a very isolated area, you not only have books you can go to, you get books at libraries, but you can also communicate with folks through different social media apps. And we talk a little bit in the book about how that's kind of exploded on like Instagram and on TikTok. I don't think you absolutely have to have social media, but I think social media helped with the expansion of acceptance and the changing portrayals of witchcraft, even in popular media. We had mentioned something about Hocus Pocus. Hocus Pocus 2 is different in some respects than the first one, even in its representation. That's just on everybody's mind because it just came out on Disney Plus. But I think there's many reasons for these shifting valences that we're tracing out in the book, from just the religious kind of worldview maybe opening up and the world kind of fragmenting a little bit, and that social media connection. I don't know, Lisa, I feel like I'm drawing too broad a strokes. Do you have anything you want to add? I'm like, no, things happened. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things, because I think that really nails down kind of our driving question when we started writing this book, was how did we get from we are going to put women on trial and kill them because they've been accused of witchcraft, to now I can go to Target and I can get a mug that says 100% that witch on it, and everybody like applauds. They think it's like become like this cute, I don't know, capitalism market. It's strange the way we shifted from that. So I think that really kind of hits the nail on the head. But one of the really fascinating things is that it shifted so just in tiny little increments, really, when you look at it. We've mentioned like a lot of the spiritualist women who were working, and they were able to do it because they were kind of using religion as a cover. And I think that helped them. A lot of them, in fact, Mel and I were talking about this recently, a lot of them say that they got their mediumistic, I don't know if that's the word, mediumistic powers when they say that like they were either visited by an angel, or they had some sort of prolonged illness in which God healed them, and then God gave them these powers. So they were able to attribute what they were doing to like a Christian God, which I think made it more palatable for a lot of people. And then, I think kind of alongside that, you also had pop culture, especially in the last century. In the book, we talk about like the importance of somebody like Samantha and Bewitched, kind of because that really was one of the turning points, I think, where American culture stopped looking at witches as being old and ugly and covered in warts and waiting to eat children. Possibly before that we could make the argument, and I think we talked about it a little bit, the Wizard of Oz doing that too, but just the idea of a good witch. But I think things like that just kind of slowly start happening, and then we did see it absolutely bloom and blossom with social media, because I think just so many people were able to come out and their voices couldn't be silenced.
We have Holly, who said, I read about some of these topics, though not women focused, in a book I enjoy very much, Occult America by Horowitz. It was amazing how much occult history there is in this country.
Yeah, we use that as a source, didn't we, Mel?
Yes, we did.
Yeah, that I highly recommend Occult America. In fact, I think if you purchase the book, there's a link you can get to the Quirk website, and they have all of our sources. Like, we have a suggested reading list in the back of that. Horowitz, I think, is on that suggested reading list, but we have all of our sources, and I highly recommend If this is of interest to you, just maybe start with the Horowitz books, but there's tons to do a deep dive because we barely scratched the surface with this book. And it's my hope anyway, that a lot more people will kind of become interested in the occult history of America.
When Dave says, why do you think there were differences between the Salem and Connecticut witch trials in the late 1600s?
That is a really good question. This is one of those situations where when you're writing a book that's a compendium and has to run over so many centuries, there's things that you just can only like dip your toe in. You can't go into like deep study about it. So yes, I read a couple scholarly articles about how stuff was happening in Connecticut at the same time as the Salem witch trials. But since we had decided to make our focus for that time period be Salem Village itself, I ended up not pursuing that angle, but I am fascinated by it. And I've definitely made notes to myself to continue reading about it. I will say, I feel like from what I have read, that Salem was, while not isolated in the idea of witch trials, has become like an obsession in our national imaginary. I mean, Salem itself is like a tourism for Halloween and witchcraft now. It's very much like, that's what they're kind of known for. And this has happened gradually from the time periods throughout even literature. If you think about someone like Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was connected to that time period and was writing about it. So I feel like Salem kind of became this like, as America, we don't think about the other panics that happened. We like to just kind of focus in on that one, whereas it was happening. I also feel like, just in my own personal thoughts about it when I was reading, that the Salem Village situation, because they were so isolated and they had all these issues, even the Salem town was kind of surprised that it went as far as it did. I'm wondering if the Connecticut situations just kind of didn't have that same like isolation and conflicts and issues that would cause it to kind of end maybe before. Maybe that's why we focus on Salem more. But yes, I have a friend who's an early Americanist historian, so I look forward to talking about it with him. But I'm sorry I can't fully answer your question. But it's a fascinating question, and I did not know much about witchcraft trials in Connecticut when I first started reading about this, because people just don't talk about or think about it. Salem has kind of obsessed us.
Melissa says, great presentation. Sadly, constructive occult practices are still chastised and even outlawed. I am a mystic, and whenever the topic is highlighted in conversation, most persons still treat it as taboo. Thankful for spaces such as this, which offers a forum.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I think it's so important. And I think that was one thing that I was really glad we could talk about in talking about this book. Is just, I mean, really, when you talk about having those kind of communities of care where people can talk about this openly, it really is about upholding things like freedom of religion and freedom of free speech. And I don't know, I find it fascinating that and we've made a lot of progress in many ways when you think about going from where we were in Salem to where we are now, but we're still having the same conversations too, in a lot of ways, which is a little frustrating too.
Don't see any questions. I have a couple of questions. Your 2019 collection, Monsters She Wrote, featured important and forgotten women behind horror and speculative fiction. What inspired you to move beyond fiction and focus on women, both famous and less known, and their evolving relationships to the cult in Toil and Trouble?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have an answer for that. I know Mel and I we're having just a lot of conversations. A lot of what we've talked about. The occult was in many ways kind of a ribbon that kind of goes through Monster She Wrote. Like a lot of the women were interested in the occult and were actually practicing different things. And so I think that that felt like kind of a natural progression for us to then begin talking about their lives outside of fiction, which led to this. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have really an easy answer to that, other than if you put us together long enough, we're probably going to talk about something occult or horror related. So it's just kind of blossomed into a book.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we both had interests in different aspects of the occult and history, and there were writers we talked about in Monster She Wrote that dabbled in it, particularly in mediumship and some in the Ghost Club. And so, yeah, our interests already kind of tended in that way. And then we just started seeing what was going on in pop culture. I mean, if we're thinking about like, post 2016, I guess, and started talking about that and just, why there seems to be this growth in this community and this way of using this to protest against politics in particular. And it reminded me a bit of like the spiritualism. And so, yeah, just roundabout conversations and going down rabbit holes, basically, kind of will do that. But I do think you can see some tenuous connections between Monster She Wrote and Toil and Trouble, even though one is historical figures and one is authors.
S.L. Johnson says the C.T. Witch Memorial page on Facebook is very informative. Steve says, what do you think of Jean Dixon and her automatic writing process? Any relation to witchcraft or spiritualism?
I apologize. I missed most of that because children came in.
It was, what do you think of Jean Dixon and her automatic writing process? Any relation to witchcraft or spiritualism?
I don't know, Mel, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, I know a lot of spiritualists. I don't know, they did automatic writing quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, and she's an interesting figure too, in that she, had I think newspaper columns, an astrology column. Kind of reminds me a bit of some of the folks that we talked about in the book, including like Evangeline Smith. She also, predicted, had the prediction of an assassination, which kind of connects her to some of the other folks who had predictions that kind of helped them gain influence. Automatic writing, that does come kind of from spiritualism. That was a way. So there were various ways that spiritualists would try to contact the dead or their spirit controls. They could go into trances. They could use a planchette. And that was kind of the beginning, I guess, of automatic writing. So you'd have a pencil that you would then be in a trance, and basically spirit would be moving your hand. So yeah, I mean, that would come from that, which, I mean, I'm sure goes back even farther beyond spiritualists, but definitely a connection there. One of the mediums that we talk about in the book, Leonore Piper, was a trance medium who used automatic writing. So that was something that was particularly popular there.
One of the things that, this is just completely a side note, but I've noticed lately, just kind of scrolling through the occult hashtags on social media, that there's quite a few people who are now doing automatic writing online. And that was something that I had always thought was just maybe I don't know, maybe not as in fashion today as some things. I mean, you can go to Walmart and see tarot cards or Barnes and Noble and, pick up those. So, there are things that are more popular, but it's kind of neat to see the way things are shifting in popularity too, because I think we might see more of that.
And S.L. Johnson says, for those in Connecticut interested in spiritualism, the Hillstead Museum in Farmington has a wonderful exhibit, Radical Spirits by Hilma's Ghost, after Hilma A.F. Clint, of course.
I'll just say she's a personal favorite, and that's all I have to say about that. I love her work.
They also say the builder of the Hillstead was involved with spiritualism and had the largest spiritualist library in the country at one time. Interesting.
Yeah, I'm sensing a trip in my future.
So I'll ask, from witch talk to films like The Witch and Suspiria, we've seen occult trends move to mainstream spaces in pop culture. What do you think the effects of that shift have been?
Well, I think Lisa could probably talk more to Suspiria than I can, but I do feel like The Witch is an interesting take. I mean, this is a movie that came out a few years ago, but it's kind of almost like a Nathaniel Hawthorne story. It's very much a kind of almost like fable, and it puts us right back in that early time period in American history. So it's interesting to me that in the 21st century, we're still kind of going over that and what it could mean and what does it mean that at the end of the movie, she joins this group. Is it a good thing for her? Or is it the only option that she has at that point? So we're still trying, I think we say something in the book about how in that movie, it's almost like we're still trying even now to tease out the options that a woman like Thomason would have had in that time period. But yeah, I mean, if you think of like movies with witches in them, not counting Wizard of Oz, but like pre-1960s, there are a lot of kind of negative portrayals of witches or people who are practicing in the occult. Lisa, do you want to jump in on Suspiria and how that might play a role?
Yeah, well, I mean, Suspiria, I mean, especially if I'm talking about like the original Suspiria, it draws a lot from fairy tales, and kind of those, especially when the fairy tales were really closely related to horror. And so the witches are going to be something like very predatory and terrifying. And then you kind of have the like, the innocent girl who's getting caught up in it. But now that I think about it, I mean, that could be the story of The Witch as well, the film, because I mean, it is also something that is very scary. I mean, this is one thing that I think we do kind of touch on in the book over the course of it, and I think you can see it in pop culture as well as kind of in the real history. But the witch has always been a powerful symbol. Like it's usually a woman who is powerful, and because she is powerful, she's something to be feared. Now, sometimes depending on what story you're in, the fear is very warranted because she is doing some terrible things and scary things. I did force Mel to watch The Witch, and I don't know if she liked me for that or not. But I mean, because some really terrible things happen in that movie. But you could also look at it as, were they all due to like the supernatural powers in that, or because there's also a lot of religious extremism and the kind of dangerous fervor that can go along with it, and what happens when a young woman is growing up in an extremely misogynistic society, and the dangers that that places her in. So it's not just on the witchcraft itself. But I think probably the point of it, especially if you're looking at like Suspiria and taking all that in it too, the occult really is a tool. And that's one thing that we talk about a lot in the book. And that's why we wanted to include not just, I think, stories that celebrate the occult, but there are some where they kind of show how it can be wielded in the wrong way, I think. Because it is a tool to power, and that power it could be good or bad depending on who is holding it. And I think that's one thing that is really fascinating when you kind of track the witch in pop culture, because she's not always going to be like a powerful figure. And even if she is presented as like powerful and feminist, which I think the witch is, and maybe even Suspiria, you could argue that it is, it doesn't mean that it is all good, and that there isn't really kind of scary, evil things happening, evil in air quotes, happening there. So, yeah, that's one thing that I have to think about.
And I think it's interesting too, like how that power is dealt with too in like some movies. If you think of like the movie Bell Book and Candle, which isn't necessarily a horror movie, but she has to give up her power to be married. And so this idea of, or Samantha even, I mean, she kind of almost like she was supposed to give up her powers to be married to a mortal. So you also have in these narratives of shows that aren't necessarily horror per se, this idea that even if you are a witch and it's acceptable, your power still has to maybe be curtailed or controlled in some way as well.
Are there any particular films that you think have very accurate or best portrayals of witchcraft and the occult, other than the ones that are already mentioned?
That is a good question.
I mean, would The Craft be an answer? I mean, there were advisors on set for both.
Yeah, and I mean, there were quite a few starting in movie. Like if you're looking at film history, starting in the 90s, I think it really started to be a trend to have these occult advisors on set to make sure that they were getting some things right. I think I heard that like Practical Magic had one for a while, and The Craft, of course, had one, and several others that are not coming to my mind right now. But I will just say, kind of anecdotally, I have heard people say that even though The Craft doesn't get it perfect, that there is a lot that people appreciate in how kind of a real world, like occult coven is presented. So, and I think that's one of those movies too, in particular, that was really, really important when you look at the progression towards acceptance in the occult, because there were a lot of young girls, especially, who actively sought out like internet chat rooms and books. Silver Raven Wolf is talked about a little bit in the book, but after seeing The Craft and wanting to learn more about it. So I think that's a good one to talk about. Like I said, I don't know if it gets everything right. I don't really think it does. But I think it did at least do that well. And it did have an occult advisor on set to kind of help make sure that they were being careful in how they were presenting it. And it also kind of shows both sides, because you see that power being wielded in a really responsible way, and then in a not so responsible way over the course of the movie as well. So yeah, I think that movie did do a lot right.
Yeah, Holly saying a recent favorite for me is Hagazusa from 2017. And Steve said, I love the discovery of witches, a fun look at modern witches.
I have not seen that 2017 movie, but now I'm going to look it up for sure.
And wrapping up, what are the key takeaways you hope people find while reading the book?
I think maybe I would like for people not to think that the occult is something that is maybe as scary or as on the fringe as they think it is, that it has a much more important role in our society than maybe we've talked about in the past, and that, I don't know, like anything, we need to be working towards more inclusivity in the occult and out of the occult. I think that's a good lesson to take.
Yeah, I agree. I think too, something that, we said with Monster She Wrote is, we hope that this will kind of spur readers to not only go find the women that we talk about, but also others. And, I think anytime you try to open up a discussion about the occult, you can find more and more women, even beyond obviously what we could include in the book. And so, yeah, I don't know. For me, it has been fascinating kind of looking at American history, but as a flip side to it, the side that you don't always see. I've taught classes in American literature and had not been aware in the past that, there were people practicing the occult who were involved or being mentioned in the very books I was reading or teaching. And so it's been great to look at American history, I think, through that lens and opening it up a little bit.
Oh, if you're going to read any kind of early American literature, like the occult stuff is much more fun than, like, say, Cotton Mather.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to Lisa and Melanie. This is a great event, and please check out their new book.